webinar from Actio. I'm Guilherme Barbassa, Actio CEO, and today we have Michael Montgomery here with us for us to talk a bit about OKRs and how do we connect these OKRs to long-term strategy. Welcome, Daniel. Sorry, um, Daniel Montgomery. Well, Daniel is a thought leader on OKR, and he has a book, Start Less, Finish More, and also works with Agile Strategies, consulting company, right? Welcome, Daniel. Thank you for your time, and thank you for sharing with us your expertise. Before we dive into the event itself, let me just give you some brief information for all of us. We're going to talk about OKRs and its connection to long-term strategy today for about 45 to 50 minutes. In this period, you can ask us questions, okay? So on the chat, you will find a link to Slido where you can put in the questions you want us to address. And at the end, we're going to address some of the questions. Maybe we won't be able to get to all of them, but we'll try to address as much as we can. So after the initial 15 minutes of presentation, we're going to have about 10 minutes just to organize the questions. And meanwhile, I'll just show you how this integration of OKRs and other long-term strategy execution methodologies can be done using technology. So I'm going to have a very brief 10-minute overview of the software, and then we dive into the questions into the 15 last minutes of our event. So please contribute with us with your questions, your comments as well, and hope we have a great event as we've been having in the past few months. Well, welcome, Daniel. And let's start.
Someone's at the doorbell.
OKRs is something that has been very much in vogue, right? Very common. And long-term strategy, but it's actually pretty recent, right? The recent wave in the past few years. While working long-term strategy is something that has been, I guess, since the 50s or more, right? So we have decades of knowledge, of accumulated knowledge of strategy execution and strategy formulation. And how do these two big trends connect with each other? How do these methodologies complement or compete with each other, right? And how to do this in practice in the companies, in the day-to-day enterprise and day-to-day business that everybody is involved with. And this is a very big question, so I'll try to break it down so we can address it in parts and digest it easier, right? First point is the timeline. Strategy usually addresses 3 years, 5 years, even 10 years, depending on the business we're in. While OKRs have a shorter span, right, or shorter expectation of delivery. How do these two things connect or complement each other?
Well, thanks, Guy. Thanks for having me.
I think of them as two separate things. I think some people have gotten the idea that OKRs are a way to do strategy, but I think without having a long-term view of where you're trying to go, you may be just kind of flopping around spinelessly. So that doesn't really make a lot of sense. So I see OKRs as a way to execute strategy, but you still need to have a strategy in the first place. I do think that the idea of what strategy is changing really rapidly. I mean, when you mentioned the 50s, a lot of strategic planning came out of the military, for instance, and so there was an idea with traditional strategic planning that you could project things 3 to 5 years into the future, which is, I think, that's an epistemological error, you could say, that we think we know what the future will look like because we're going to project past trends into the future. And I think since we're talking about the 1950s, I know in the American context, yeah, you could be working for General Motors and estimate what the market would be for Chevrolets 3 years into the future, because the economy was growing at a fairly predictable rate. The industries were mature and quite stable that strategic planning was used in. And so that worked up to a point. And it was fine if the senior leaders of the organization understood the strategy, and then they just got everybody else to execute the strategy, to implement the strategy. But everything really started changing once we got into the 1970s and the 80s and 90s, and it just gets faster and more uncertain all the time. So OKRs came out of the environment of Silicon Valley, which even, by the time you got to the late 70s, was extremely competitive. Lots of uncertainties in the market, lots of rapid changes in technology, the idea that you could double computing power every 18 months. So it was a very different game than making Chevrolets. But I think at the same time, they are complementary, to answer your question. We see OKRs as a way to implement strategy, but the way we've done strategy in the past, where we went into so much detail about just how many units we'd manufacture and what the cash flow would be, we can't do that. We need a much leaner strategy approach, and it's what I call a minimum viable strategy, to steal a term from agile software development, where you talk about minimum viable product. This is a minimum viable strategy, and then you use OKRs to iterate the strategy and adapt the strategy more rapidly, rather than believing that you know where you're going to be in 5 years.
Yeah. Well, this concept of a minimum viable strategy is pretty interesting. I'd like to ask you to expand on it a little bit more, because what could we consider minimum viable strategy? What elements should be considered in this concept?
Okay, Antonio, can you show that first slide that we talked about, please? So, I mean, the difference with a minimum viable strategy here is that we're trying to just answer a few questions. So you can depict what this strategy looks like on a page or two if you were printing it out. So these are the questions that we're trying to answer. How is the landscape changing? Just in general, are new competitors entering the market? Are new technologies coming in? What kind of opportunities and disruptions does the future present to us? The second question is, well, against all of that, to filter all of that, well, who are we? Why do we exist? And that's where you get into questions of your long-term mission or purpose, your values and things like that. Now, those things don't change that often, so you may not look at that every year and change it. But those are really foundational to the rest of what you do. But where it starts really getting relevant here is that there are the questions of where to play and how to win. So this was a concept that a great strategist named Roger Martin has come up with, where you basically look at those two things have to fit together. So if you say, well, where to play, that has to do with a lot of traditional market segmentation. What's our target market? Where are they geographically? Where are we in the distribution chain? What is the offer of a product service we make to them? But then when you look at that, then you have to say, well, if that's our choice, how do we win? So what value proposition can we create that will attract and sustain that market? And then what kind of capabilities do we need to do it? So in the process, you might actually go through quite a few combinations of items 3, 4, and 5 here, land on the one that looks the best, and then say, define some North Stars. And this is the way I like to think about what used to be called a strategic vision, because I find a lot of those aren't really actionable. So a North Star is something that is more, it's a big, measurable kind of success factor. Like, how are you defining winning the game? So, the biggest selling book on OKRs, of course, is Measure What Matters by John Doerr. And in that book, they talk about how Google, when they bought YouTube, evolved what they wanted that North Star to be. And their first idea was, well, let's just track how many users we have, which is very common in any kind of cloud software sort of implementation. But they started realizing, no, what we really want, we want to make YouTube very compelling for people. So rather than the number of users, we want to know how long are users actually spending on the platform. So they're trying to make sure, well, is YouTube actually compelling? Are we making this a place where people go for entertainment and information? And so they defined the North Star as the number of hours that people were on it. And then they organized everything they did through the organization in order to do that. So these are the elements of a minimum viable strategy. What you'll notice is missing, that you often see in a lot of strategic plans. There's not a long list of initiatives, budgets, 3-year rolling revenue forecasts, none of that kind of stuff, because we're taking a more iterative approach to setting goals and budgeting in this kind of a model.
Okay, so this is a big change for when the company adopts OKR as an enterprise initiative, like as the main way to execute strategy. The plan doesn't come with details, right? You actually just receive directives and a direction to go for, and each one will align, each person or department will align themselves with this macro vision of the company. Is my interpretation correct?
Yeah, absolutely. And the difference is, traditionally, we focused people on output. Like, we want you to, make 20,000 widgets a month, whatever it might be. This is a different kind of thinking. And this is the thing that people find a little hard to get especially when we talk about key results. People think, well, the key result is getting some task done or delivering something. Whereas the outcome, we're really more focused on the value that we're actually creating. And it's hard for people to get their head around that initially, to think that way. So the idea is, we have a better educated workforce than ever, and we want them very engaged in the process. So it makes more sense to say, here's the outcome that we're after. And it's up to you to help figure out how to get there. So that's a big difference. So you don't need all of that detailed planning, because the old idea came out of an old industrial model where, a lot of the workers were not educated, and management assumed, we will tell people what to do, and then we will look at the outcome. But we're trying to spread this outcome thinking further into the organization and encourage and empower people to make more of their own decisions and follow through on their own commitments.
Sure. So that actually leads into the second point I had prepared of difference and main question here, that is autonomy, right?
Mm-hmm.
So when you say that we give them the main vision and we expect everyone to align to it and create their own objectives and key results that are going to be enough and sufficient uh, to execute this strategy. That's a very different approach from the long-term strategy plan that we're used to seeing, right? That we maybe top down will define your part, your role in this, in the execution of this strategy will be this, right? This part, this deliverable, or this result. And in doing so, in this long-term strategy plan, you can stress the model and test it to see if the sum of the parts will deliver the whole. That is, if all of the departments and managers and directors with their respective goals and projects and initiatives, if everybody does it, the strategy will be executed because you have time to test it. If you, in the model that in which works OKR works, I understand that each part of the company has a lot of autonomy in defining what are their objectives and key results, right?
Right.
How do you, in this autonomous model, how do you assure that the sum of everybody's objectives and key results will lead to the strategy? I mean, is it enough? Is it sufficient to execute the strategy? How do you connect that?
Well, I think first off, you have to make sure that people understand what the strategy is, which is why I think it's very important that the strategy be minimal. That you should be able to, communicate that and people should get what it is. Because what I've found, I mean, I've been doing strategic planning a lot longer than I've been using OKRs. And, forever I've seen that the problem most organizations have is that the understanding of the strategy decays rapidly the further you get from the executive suite. And often a lot of it may be in one leader's head. And there's the attitude that we'll communicate this. I mean, a term I really came to hate earlier in my career working in big organizations was need to know basis. So we'll look, Guy, we'll just tell you what you need to know when you need to know it. So we don't want you to have the big picture of what's going on. We'll just tell you what to do when the time comes. So you just wait for that. That doesn't work in this kind of a model. So you have to communicate, over communicate what you're doing to people. And this is, I think the newer generations of management, we see this happening already with the idea they do need to understand it. So that's an absolute prerequisite for people setting the OKRs, because they need to have a conversation on their particular team about how do we understand what the strategy is, and then how does our team actually contribute to that? How might we do that? And so then you tell them what the strategy is, you bring in the grammar or the language of OKRs and say, okay, write some OKRs. Now, you still need to talk about that through the whole organization such that there's transparency. That's definitely one of the superpowers of OKRs. There's transparency. So it isn't a free-for-all. The leaders at all levels need to understand what the OKRs that are bubbling up beneath them. And depending on the kind of organization that you've got, you might have a budget for like how many OKRs directly support things that are at the top of the organization versus which ones are bubbling up from underneath. So let's just say we start off and we say, well, it's 50-50. So if a team has two OKRs, one of them ought to support, there's like 4 big OKRs at the company level, and here's the one that we can support the best. But we also have issues of our own. So one example I've used a lot, I work with a wellness resort in the Caribbean. So it's on an island. They have a great workforce for people who are in the direct guest service areas, housekeeping and food and beverage. They're absolutely great. It's a really good job to have there. But they were really having a hard time finding technical people to do digital marketing for them. And this was a few years ago, so admittedly a dated example, but it's a small island, and you don't have schools that teach people to do digital marketing. Those are really rare skills. And so that department had an objective to increase the attractiveness of the jobs, increase the retention of people in the job. But that was a unique problem to that department. So that's the example of bottom up complementing top down. And so depending on the team you're in, the amount may vary, the classic example from Google in the software engineering department was 2/3 of the OKRs were bottom up because, they were trying to use the cache they were generating from search in order to come up with new ideas. And that's been very successful. That's how they came up with Gmail and so many other great products we all use that they've come up with. So you want that mix in order to engage people so they don't feel like we're not just serving these large, abstract, strategic objectives. We're also trying to make our own job better and finding the balance.
And you touched on a point that is also a question for me. That is, how can we connect this with corporate budget, right? Because OKRs are very dynamic, right? They usually have a time span of 3 months and roll 4 times a year, right? And the initiatives, the effort needed to execute or reach the key results, you need resources, right?
Mm-hmm.
And to run a budget, especially in big corporations, is something very time consuming and effort intensive, right?
Right.
How do you connect this agile structure of OKRs of every 3 months coming up with new objectives, new initiatives, with having the money ready to support these key results?
Right. That's a great question. And I have to say, I don't think many organizations have been very progressive about thinking about budgeting. There's a whole movement in Europe called Beyond Budgeting, which I think is a great idea, where the idea is that they do typically a 6-quarter rolling forecast and develop notional budgets based on that. But the thing is it can be adapted. Like every quarter, you're reviewing what you're doing 6 months ahead. Now, this just has not caught on at all in North America, and I don't understand why. I'm not a finance person. I don't understand what the problem is, but I think what people who have studied the larger question of how does the whole organization become agile say that resource fluidity is really important. So because so many organizations, you're right, they have all of this money locked up in different little cost centers, and the managers of those cost centers feel like, well, that's my budget. Don't take my budget away from me. Instead of getting focused more on common purpose. So I've seen some progress in the software development world where they'll do value stream budgeting. Like if you look at the Scaled Agile framework, that's an element that they talk about in there. I haven't seen that applied as much as it could be to other functions in the organization, though. So I think it's a frontier. I think it's an area where we can make more progress.
Right. It's something in development right now, then. Interesting. Another topic I wanted to ask you about is about coexistence of methodologies, right? So in the beginning of your talk, you talked about like OKRs were originated in Silicon Valley with tech companies, very agile, very dynamic market. In contrast with what the origin of long-term strategy, army or armed forces or car manufacturers. But we still manufacture cars today, right?
Yeah,
and a car is not a software. So, and even in big companies, tech companies like Intel or NVIDIA or even Google, you have stable processes, right?
Mm-hmm.
You have to manufacture the chip,
Right.
How and then how can these two worlds that many times exist within the same company, right? Coexist because they have different needs, different demands, and there are methodologies like balanced scorecard or management by objectives like MBOs or even just managing KPIs for performance, right? And structured project management, PMI style, with Gantt graphs and critical paths and all that. All of this has its application still today, right? Given the different processes that exist in each company and the different cultures of company, different markets where they're inserted into. So, how do you see the coexistence of OKRs with these different practices like balanced scorecards and MBOs?
Okay. Yeah, and like the question you're asking to me is really on two levels. Like to me, balanced scorecard, OKRs, and MBOs are all about strategic goals, which is, you're here and you're trying to get here. The issue of KPIs versus OKRs or any of those other models is kind of one of what's operational versus what is strategic. So I'm going to just treat those as two separate questions. So slide 3, Antonio. So let's talk about that, because there's been an evolution. Like MBO, management by objectives, came about in the 1950s from Peter Drucker because he was trying to get away from that old industrial model and say, now we have a lot of knowledge workers, and so they need to be involved in setting their own goals and understanding how they're contributing, rather than just being told, like, move this pile of iron ore from here to over here. So management by objectives was very top down, and it tended to only focus on the individual manager. So this is a model that's been around for a long time. When I started my career, I was in a training function, and this is what we were teaching people to do. So the idea there was that you'd set annual objectives. They were tied to compensation. If you achieve your objective, you should get a bonus. And it basically cascaded down through the management hierarchy, through the organization. So the intent of it was to ensure that everyone was complying with what the overall strategy was. Now, what Andy Grove did at Intel, which actually led to objectives and key results, and I'll come back to balanced scorecard, was he said, well, what we're doing is so complicated that even if I am the CEO, I don't understand what a lot of the engineers are working on. So it can't be entirely top down, they have to tell me what they need too. It has to be a two-way conversation. And that's what I talked about earlier, the mix between top down and bottom up. So we need to involve more people in it. It isn't just management, it's also engineering as well. And so because we're doing things that are very risky and we're in an uncertain market, we'll have a loose coupling to compensation, but not an exact one, because we can't predict all the factors that'll lead to success or not. And that's where you started to get more of an idea of stretch goals. So objectives and key results is a good technique to use if you're trying to achieve stretch goals and involve the whole workforce in it. That's the big difference. In the meantime, we had this thing called Balanced Scorecard, which I worked with for years, which that came out of the late 80s, early 90s, Fortune 500 environment. And so that is, as you mentioned, Guy, if you're in a relatively stable situation and you're trying to just, improve your position within that, Balanced Scorecard is great. The thing that's great with Balanced Scorecard is it's designed to be comprehensive. You have goals that address financial performance, performance vis-a-vis your customer, the productivity and the culture and the learning of the people that work in your organization, and process improvement and technology and all of that. So each of those perspectives may have some goals. So I really loved working with that model for years because it was so holistic that way. And you can apply that model to objectives and key results. So in some organizations, we'll see that the organization as a whole might have a balanced scorecard, and the areas that need to move faster, like product development, might use OKRs, but you might not need OKRs in some other kinds of functions that are more stable. So maybe, can we look at the next slide? I'll just illustrate this point. Because what I discovered in the research I did for my book was that Google itself, since everybody reads about how successful Google was and we want to emulate Google, you can't do that because they don't imitate themselves. They use OKRs where they need to use OKRs. So I talked to someone who was involved in facilities. So that's an example you were talking about, Guy, of a kind of function that maybe doesn't need OKRs because they're running a bus system to, come into San Francisco and pick up employees. That's a key performance indicator. Are the buses on time? Do the buses have enough capacity? So you're just constantly trying to manage to that rather than doing something dramatically new. So in this model, this is something I borrowed from McKinsey, and these are 3 different strategy horizons. So in the one where you're doing business as usual, keeping the lights on, you're going to use KPIs in that kind of context. If you've got a relatively stable business, but let's say, you're active in the state of Nebraska, but you want to move into Kansas, well, that's incremental growth. Like you're going to offer the same product to the same kind of people, but you're growing. So that's horizon 2. You may not have revenue from that yet. So that's where we start using OKRs. But that might be what you call a committed OKR. Like we're very clear, we know how to open a new McDonald's in a new neighborhood. So it's just a matter of buckling down and doing it. Whereas the real stretch goals, where you get these big OKR stories, tend to be more in horizon 3, where you're actually innovating an entire new service and value. But all of these things are actually equally important. And that's a challenge we often see when we're brought in to work with OKRs, because I think you have to honor the kind of work that keeps the lights on, right? That's something we all learned during the pandemic, that, the people that work in those grocery stores, the people who pick up the trash they're as important as any of us to keep society, to keep all of us harmoniously working together. So all of these things need to be there. Like it's not all the glory of brand new products.
Yeah. So on these two levels that you separated, balance scorecard or MBOs and OKRs, they actually complement each other, right?
They do. We could go back, Antonio. They do, because I think the balanced scorecard came out of large, complex organizations um, who were mostly in a relatively stable market and needing to do things like, what you do strategically in that case is you're trying to improve margins. You're not reinventing the wheel by any means. You're trying to make the wheel more efficient. So back in the 90s, when I started my career in consulting, we were talking about, process reengineering. So we weren't challenging what we were in business to do. We were just finding a way to be much more efficient in delivering it. That was the name of the game in those days. Objectives and key results came out of Silicon Valley, where you're inventing entire new products that we didn't even know we need. Like, here's my iPhone. And in 2007, when that was introduced, I didn't know that I needed one little thing. Like, if you'd asked me, well, like the whole joke is Henry Ford, 100 years ago, Ford Motor Company said, if I'd asked my customers what they wanted, they would have said, give me a faster horse, because that's all they had in mind. He reinvented transportation by making cars, which were a luxury item up until then, available to average people. So, if you're in a more stable environment, balanced scorecard is fine. Balanced scorecard can be great to define the overall organization. It depends on operational tempo. So, from a data software point of view, all of these systems have the same, what I would call molecular structure, in that you have an objective, and then you have ways you're measuring the attainment of the objective. We had that in balanced scorecard, we had that in MBO, and we have that in OKRs. It's just a question of how fast are we moving, and how uncertain are we? And that would determine which one of these you'd use.
The DNA thread behind each of these is the same, right?
Right, absolutely.
And on the other level that you commented on, KPIs and OKRs, do you usually see the departments adopting one or another? So if it's a more stable process, that will go for KPIs. If it requires more innovation, or you have more uncertainty of where you're gonna go, you adopt OKRs, or do you see them also mixing and being used or coexisting in the departmental scope of application?
You mean like in the same department?
In the same department, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, because that's that horizon one. There are things you just absolutely have to do to keep working. And I think that's been one of the misconceptions in OKRs, because one anti-pattern I see is people go in and say they want to come up with OKRs for everything. And you don't need OKRs for everything. Some things you need KPIs for, and you can't take your eye off that ball. So no, you're absolutely right.
Okay.
They can coexist.
Great. And even though OKRs has been around for a few years now, many companies are still starting to adopt it, or are interested in adopting it, but hasn't taken the first steps yet.
Mm-hmm.
What are the first, how to begin, right, using OKR in your organization?
Well, I think at least two things. I mean, one of them is you do need to be clear on your strategy. Like, where are you trying to go? Because I've had some people contact me, they want to work with OKRs, but they don't have a clear shared idea of what they want to do differently than what they're doing now. In which case, don't talk about OKRs. So it's like you need to have some vision of where you're trying to go. Absolutely. And we can help clarify what that vision is, but you need something like that in order to do that. So that's the minimum viable strategy piece, I think, just to give everybody an anchor. The second thing I think would be just giving people adequate training to understand that this is in many ways a new language and a new way of thinking about goals. It requires outcome thinking, like we talked about at the beginning, and regular conversations to check in and see how we're doing. So I think the training and understanding how to manage it on an ongoing basis is really, and making a commitment to that is really important.
Yeah, great. And when you say to have a vision or a minimal viable strategy, my understanding is that it's not more of the same. It's not like I'm gonna do the same I do now, but more. It's that just requires replication, right? Uh, when you say create to have a clear vision of where you want to go, is and that is a prerequisite to start working with OKRs. But I'm trying to understand here. The vision must, in this case, should be not just grow today's operation, but create new things, address new markets, new products, right?
You've got it. It's creating new value in the world. And it's great you bring that up, because it's like becoming more profitable is not a very interesting objective. I think it's a very valid key result, but not the objective. The objective needs to be more inspiring than that. We're going to create a whole new, just to pick on YouTube. I'm a big fan and user of YouTube. We're creating a whole new video environment, that enables people to share things with other people, to find all kinds of entertainment that's outside of what's controlled by cable and the regular networks and all that kind of thing. So it's focused on the customer. I mean, it's the same idea with any kind of digital transformation we're talking about. It's about staying focused on the value to the customer and thinking about that outcome, and then orienting your actions around that.
Great. We still have a few minutes before we can dive into, the how to do it using technology and the questions and answers. So I'll ask you an additional question on something that you touched on with your slide that where you compared like MBO, balanced scorecard, and OKRs. That is more to the human resources side of it. How do you motivate or align people's efforts with these objectives? In the MBO model or column you showed, you had like the objectives aligned with incentives, with bonuses, right?
Right.
And that's a fairly straightforward way to get people motivated to reach those goals and implement those objectives, right? I know that OKRs do not work that way. And you, on your slide, you had that it's more of a loose connection or something in that sense. So the question is, again, do these two things work in parallel? And the second question would be two things. I mean, incentives, to have a structure, bonus structure, and a way to motivate or incentivize people into alignment. And the second question is, if OKR does not work in that way, because it can distort the objectives and the like own shots, right?
Right.
How do you get people motivated and aligned with these objectives?
Right. Great question. Well, and as you're referring to, I think if if you tied bonuses really or salary increases very directly to OKRs, what the natural human thing to do is to create very safe goals, right? Oh, I know I can do this. So we call that sandbagging. You're just you're building a defense, like with sandbags. So when we talk about loosely coupled, what it really means is we emphasize that OKRs are a team sport. And the way that a person as a team member works with OKRs, I think, is a fair thing to evaluate as part of a performance appraisal. It's part of being a good team player. And I think it's fair to evaluate people on whether they're good team players. And OKRs, when done right, are a great way to encourage this kind of team play. You don't, though, want to tie the salary directly to the accomplishment of the key results in most cases, because then people will set really safe targets. So I hope that makes sense to everybody on the call. That there are some exceptions. I think in the case of really senior management, like it or not, you are responsible for achieving the big stretch goals of the company. That's why senior executives get paid more. They're taking on much more responsibility and much more risk. So I think them, and then I think certain commission salespeople, I think it actually makes sense for them. But those two categories, to me, are the exception that proves the rule. The great mass of people should not be, they should be held responsible for how they participate in the OKR process, not for the results. And I hope that makes sense to everybody.
Yeah, to do a recognition based on contribution and effort, not necessarily the delivery, because the delivery, it's uncertain times and certain projects, right?
Exactly.
But for top level and sales, you think bonuses still are make sense, right?
Right, because I can't imagine going into a board meeting, in a for-profit company and saying, like, don't do that. I don't think they just wouldn't go along with me if I said that. That's just not at that level in the economy. That's just not the way things work.
And they look at the bottom line. So the bonuses must be aligned to the bottom line that in ultimate analysis will be the deliverable, right?
Absolutely. That's the way it works.
The shareholders always looking for that, right?
Yep, of course.
Right. Well, Daniel, thanks a lot for all of this insight. It was really interesting. Still stay with us because we have the questions and answers, right? I'll dive into the software now that is a software from Actio called Seed, and it executes all of these methodologies in a single platform in an integrated way. While I'm navigating the software, please continue putting in your questions that we'll address them in about 10 minutes, okay? And I'll ask to put Daniel's Agile Strategies website link on the chat so that if you wish to contact him directly, please do so. I'm sure he will be glad to follow up on these contacts. Okay, let me share my screen with you. And let's take a look how this can be done in practice, right? In the day-to-day execution of your strategy. So I logged into the software, and here in this example, we have a strategic map in the balanced scorecard model, right? Let's not going to, it's just a generic map so that we can follow up on the execution of the strategy. And here we have like the strategic objectives and how they're going. And behind each strategic objective, I have KPIs and initiatives. So let's dive into this one, see what's behind this particular strategic objective. So I have the objective, I have two KPIs, EBITDA margin and EBITDA, and a portfolio of projects here, right? The projects or initiatives, I can manage them and follow up on them with S-curve, percentage execution, and so on. So very traditional project management. And the KPIs, I can cascade them in a NBO style, going like first checking, the performance of each KPI and just cascading it into the KPIs that are connected, and eventually projects and even risks that are attached to these KPIs and objectives. And you can drill down this cascading structure all the way to operational KPIs, right? So this is a very structured long-term plan that goes from a strategy that is communicated through the strategic map, and each objective is cascaded throughout the company, and each manager has its own objectives, initiatives, and risks that they should be looking at, right? So this is the traditional way. But you also have inside this company departments or even subsidiaries that may be using OKRs to manage its strategy execution. So how do these things connect? First, let's take a look at the OKRs in this example. So I'm not going to show the whole software. This would take a lot longer. I'm just focusing on this connection, right, of OKRs and long-term strategy. So here I have a list of OKRs. I could filter, just my department or the objectives or initiatives that I am interested in. And we have quite a few objectives and people and projects. Let's dive into these ones. So this strategic objective has one OKR connected to it. It's actually doing pretty well. And it has three key results, right? Each key results, I can open it, see how it's going, check, see the check-ins, so how it's evolving throughout time, the confidence level for reaching that key results within the time frame, and even the initiatives that are behind. So what's being done to reach this key result, right? So for each of the key results, I may have many initiatives, check-ins, and so on. So how does this connect to the objective? Remember the objective I clicked on in the strategic map? It was this one, add value to the shareholder, right? And I have a vision of the OKRs connected to that strategic objective. So I'm connecting the two methodologies, an objective that was established with a balanced scorecard model with the OKRs here. And for each objective within the OKRs, I can cascade it further, right? And see other objectives that are connected to this objective. So if you have like this is maybe a CTO objective, the Chief Technology Officer objective. Well, not this example, but imagine it would be. Maybe the IT department would have its own objectives connected to the CTO objective, right? And each objective with its own key results and so on, where we can cascade it further. Here we have an example of one objective cascading from another objective. So this objective, I can drill down its own KPIs, and on its turn, it can have its own objectives on the third level. And you can drill down all the way to whatever level you have OKRs running in your corporation. So this is a way that OKRs can coexist and connect with other methodologies like MBOs and balanced scorecard. Here, just something interesting. The software can help you or help the squad or the team that is establishing OKRs, right, or key results, by suggesting objectives or even key results for that specific objective using the artificial intelligence that is embedded within the software, right? So we call our artificial intelligence Sophie, and you can interact with Sophie, and it will ask you questions, guiding you to find appropriate key results in this example, right? So this is just a curiosity. If you let me talk, I can talk about the software a whole day. So I think these are the points that we touched upon in our conversation with Daniel. And let's go to the questions and answers then. Antonio, could you share the questions that were uploaded? And let's start. Okay, here we are. Even as we are answering the questions, if you want to ask new questions, you can just access slido.com with this number at the left side of the screen, or just use a QR code to access the website and put in your questions. Let's go for the first one. Is Actio software able to link strategy map with OKRs into a holistic system? I guess I just anticipated the question and just showed you how we can connect the strategic map with OKRs, and not just the strategic map, but the strategic objectives and even KPIs and initiatives connected to, or like in the second or third level of cascading from the strategic objectives with the OKRs, and the other way around as well. I can access an OKR and see if that OKR has connection with any strategic objective or any initiative, project, or KPI that was established at a higher level in the organization. So I can go both ways, right? Second question here. OKRs can feel too granular and strategy too visionary. Any tips on ensuring there is a clear link? Daniel, can you pick this one up?
I'm going to throw that one to me. Yeah, I certainly agree with that. And that's a problem we've seen with traditional strategic planning is you've got this visionary stuff up here, and then it gets translated directly into a whole lot of very specific initiatives. And there is a link missing there. So with what we've talked about, again, the minimum viable strategy process ends with having one or more North Stars. So that those might be, we will, in 3 years we will be rated the best company to work for according to some, particular measurement. We will have penetrated a new market with these characteristics, those kinds of things. So the strategy should end up with North Stars, which are specific measurable outcomes for whether it's 1 to 3 years. I really wouldn't go longer than 3. And then what you can do is you make a link between the North Star then and the OKRs. And the process is this, that you say, well, the North Star is, yeah, we're going to be rated as the best place to work. You might say, well, in terms of what actually could conceivably be done in 90 days, like what is the crux of the matter? What is a challenge that we need to solve before we do something else that we can solve? So I love the term crux because it's really defining like what's the first thing that we have to do in order to create a foundation. So just as an example, I was working with a healthcare association that wants to scale up very rapidly. So we could talk about a lot of KPIs like clinical outcomes and those kinds of things that happen. But my question was, well, if your big strategy is that you want to scale, that's really your North Star. What could you do in the next 90 days that would be foundational to that kind of scaling? And they said, well, we're very unclear about what our policies and procedures are, and people aren't clear what their job roles are. So we decided to tackle that first, because if you're going to start opening new clinics in new locations, you need to have that nailed down. So that's an example of going from that North Star down to a specific OKR. I hope that helps.
Okay. Well, the next question here is, what's the difference between setting KPIs based on objectives and the OKR framework? I can try to address this one, and Daniel, please fill in the gaps that I leave behind, right? Daniel presented a slide with 3 steps, right? That is a very usual framework that we see in many situations, and I have a continuous improvement background, and we see that a lot, like in the Japanese style of management, right, where you have standardization, or just the objective is to keep the same performance. You have improvement, where you have the same process, but you're going to improve performance. And you have innovation. I mean, you have to rethink the process. You have to take big steps, right? So on the first level, where your objective is to maintain performance, KPIs are ideal, right? Because you will measure, you will monitor, you will keep your eye on that so that it will not lose performance. On the other extreme, innovation, OKRs are ideal because you're going for big changes. You're going for, and every time you go for big changes, it's more uncertain, right? And in the middle, you may have a mix of both depending on the context. So what is the difference? The cycle, the time, right? Cycle for each one. So KPIs, usually you have, it's more perenne, it's more stable. You don't change this KPI every 3 months or a year. It's the same KPI. You measure that process year in and year out. While OKRs, you will usually have It varies, but the usual is like a 3 month time span, right? For the OKR, you establish OKRs for or key results for 3 months. Another main difference is the autonomy. Usually, the goal for the KPIs are more top down. So you must maintain this level of performance, while in OKRs, it's more of a bottom up proposal. So the team has more autonomy to propose its own OKRs. So Daniel's talked a little bit about 2/3 and a third during our conversation. Um, but those for me are two of the main points or differences between setting KPIs and OKRs for a particular process or a particular scope of action, right? Daniel, any compliments
No,
here?
I think that's great. I think the only thing I would add to it is that I remember early on getting into this, talking to a friend of mine who's a lean manufacturing consultant, and he goes into that with the idea that, well, you need to standardize work. You must be able to standardize work, and there are certain kinds of work you can standardize. If you can standardize it, you can set a KPI, and that doesn't have to just be manufacturing trucks or something like that. You could look at finance processes, for instance, anything like that. If you can do that, you can set a KPI, and you can also do continuous improvement, because the thing that is staying in constant is the work that actually has to be done and what it needs to look like at the end. So that's really those first two horizons that I talked about. But then if you're like defining some whole new value proposition, obviously that doesn't apply. That's where you need an OKR. And again, as we talked about, in a given department, you may have some things that are standard and some things that are brand new.
Yeah, perfect. Well, next question. What are the challenges of starting culture of OKRs in a big size organization where employees are habituated to KPI based or other way of execution? Could you take this one on?
Okay, I'll try. That's a big one. There's no question that this is very difficult to do. I mean, you're really getting into a lot of change management here. So I think if the big size organization really wants to revolutionize the whole way that they operated, the senior leadership team has to be absolutely committed to doing it this way. And what I recommend is that they start with themselves. One big mistake I see is people will say, all right, we're going to do OKRs. Everybody, let's read a couple of books about it. Maybe we'll bring in a consultant, and then all of you, every department's got to come up with some OKRs. So you're actually reinforcing the silos if you do it that way. So what I recommend is start at the top, have a good conversation about strategy. What would need to be true for us to feel like we're actually on the road to achieving our strategy? Build OKRs about that, and then share those at that senior executive level for at least 1 or 2 quarters before you subject anybody else to OKRs. So that's one possibility. The other one would be in a case where the big organization has got a lot of standard things going on, as we were just talking about, that maybe don't start with OKRs at the top. Start with a pilot. You may have a particular area where you're trying to achieve rapid transformation and other areas where you're not. So focus on those transformational areas for OKRs and just get started there. Build a track record. If it's successful, other people will become interested.
Yeah. And another comment on that is that any cultural change takes time. It doesn't happen quickly. It takes years, and since it takes years, it requires persistence on your purpose, right? So this is a point that is very important, because I see a lot of people starting initiatives that require cultural change, and after a year give up, and then everything falls apart. So if you're embarking in a cultural change uh, effort, be ready and communicate this, that it takes time, right? And then it requires long-term commitment to it. Okay, next question. Is there the ability to add prioritization, value, ease, and sequencing due to deployment and absorption capacity to better assign which OKRs to focus on?
Sure. Should I take that one?
Yes, please.
Well, I'm going to work my way back. Absorption capacity, yes, you need to be very careful about that. You may come up with so many bright ideas about what your OKRs might look like, but you have to be clear what's your capacity to take these on, because often these are projects that may be in addition to regular work that's already being done. And so I think it's important to really start with a review of, like, what are the jobs to be done in this particular team or this company, and how many can we focus on? So like that last slide we showed that showed the 3 strategy horizons, some organizations will actually go in and budget that, like, we need to turn the company around, so 50% of our goals are going to be in Horizon 3. Another company might say, well, it might be closer to 10%. So I think you need to budget that and do think about how much you can absorb at once. As far as sequencing, a lot of people have the tendency to set up kind of a big goal for the year and then say, well, in quarter 1, we'll do this. In quarter 2, we'll have this OKR. In quarter 3, I wouldn't do that. I would set up what's the North Star for the year, the true North, whatever you want to call it. And then only set up for Q1, because you don't know if it's a stretch goal, you don't know how far you're going to get. When you get to the end of Q1, have a retrospective, look at the strategy, look at it, what may have changed in your environment. You may have a new competitor. Customer behavior may not be what you expected. Then set quarter 2. But OKRs are not a roadmap. You're defining a destination and taking a fresh look every quarter when you do that.
Yeah. We still have a few questions to go, but we're running out of time. I don't think we're going to be able to go through all of them. Let's try choosing one last question here. I'd go for the last one here on the slide. It feels like a requirement of OKR is a highly engaged workforce to get value from the up and sideways. Is this fair interpretation? I'm going to put my opinion, and then please you compliment, right? I think engagement is necessary, but this can be built through parts, right? So as Daniel suggested, create a pilot of a department that is more interested, engaged, or has its processes more innovation requirement more explicit. So find the people within the organization that will make this pilot successful. Once you have the pilot running, give it visibility, and show that this is a good method. It interacts with people, it gives more autonomy, and it delivers results. With that, you will start having people coming your way, right? and getting people engaged. So you don't have to have everybody engaged at once, like from the get-go. You can just find fertile soil to plant the seed within the corporation, and then make it that local pilot successful, and then deploy to the rest of the company as people start getting interested and moving toward the OKR methodology. Daniel, any compliments on that?
I would just add, in the case, let's say, where you've got an entire department with a big OKR, if you want to encourage the engagement up and sideways, I mean, one of the things is people have to feel like it's okay to go talk to another group about an idea that they've got. So, for instance, I want to improve the user experience, on our web-based software, but there's a problem like the database, it won't load the data fast enough to do. So I should go talk to the database people about it. What gets in the way of that is if you have a culture where I feel like it's not okay for me to just go talk to them unless I talk to my boss first, he talks to their boss, and then we set up a meeting. Whereas an organization where I feel like I can just call somebody, if we're all working, actually working physically together, I can just walk up to you in the cafeteria and say, hey, I've got an idea I want to talk about. Let's get a cup of coffee. That requires a lot of things, like they talk about psychological safety. I'm not going to be punished for doing that. I'm encouraged to kind of think across the value stream, which is what Sideways is really all about. So that's a mood that leadership has to set. That you should by all means talk to each other about how we can all get better. That's a challenge to some management styles, but OKRs really work best in that kind of a more engaged environment.
All right. Well, I thank you all for participating, and especially Daniel for lending us his expertise. And feel free to contact us. It'll be a pleasure to interact with you individually. And thank you all. See you on our next webinar.
Thanks, everybody.